I woke up to the sound of my father coughing violently in the next room. It wasn't the usual morning cough of an old man shaking off the night. This was deep, hacking, and painful. I rushed to his bedroom and found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his face pale, a cup of water in his trembling hands. His eyes met mine, full of worry. "Something's wrong with the water, son," he rasped. My stomach twisted. My father had lived in this house for over 40 years, ever since he retired from the construction business. He was a strong man, stubborn, the kind who didn't complain unless something was seriously wrong. I took the cup from his hand and sniffed it. A strange chemical smell. Panic set in. I ran to the kitchen, turned on the tap, and let the water run. It looked normal, clear even, but when I brought it close to my nose, I smelled it again. Something unnatural. Something wrong. I immediately grabbed my phone and called the water company, but after a long wait, they assured me everything was fine. But I knew better. My father had been drinking this water for weeks. If he was sick, there was a reason, and that reason wasn't natural. Determined to get answers, I started knocking on my neighbors' doors. Mrs. Thompson, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, told me she had noticed her tap water tasting strange too. Mr. Reynolds, the war veteran down the street, said he'd been having stomach issues but thought it was just age catching up to him. More and more neighbors told me the same thing. Something was happening, and it wasn't just us. My mind raced back to the HOA. The Homeowners Association had been a thorn in my father's side for years. Ever since they elected a new president, a man named Richard Holloway, things had gotten worse. Fines for small things, ridiculous rules about grass height, and now, could they really be behind this? It sounded insane, but nothing about this HOA had ever been normal. I marched straight to the HOA office, a pristine little building at the edge of our community, where Richard sat behind his desk with that smug look he always had. I wasted no time. I slammed the cup of tainted water onto his desk and demanded an explanation. He barely looked at it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen between his fingers. "There's a vote," he said, like that explained everything. "The community decided that the old water pipeline running to your father's house and a few of the other older homes was an eyesore and needed to be disconnected. So, we switched your supply." My blood boiled. They had switched our water source without telling us? Without testing it? Without warning? Richard simply shrugged. "It's within our rights," he said. "The HOA maintains the neighborhood standards. We did what was necessary." He wasn't even pretending to care. My father, my neighbors, had been drinking poison water, and to him, it was just another decision made in some fancy boardroom. I stormed out, my mind racing with rage. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was an attack. They had poisoned my father. They had poisoned my home. And they had done it because they thought they could. But they had no idea who they were messing with. I drove straight to the county office, determined to find out more about our water system. If the HOA had switched our supply, then where was the original water coming from? And more importantly, could I switch it back? Hours later, after digging through decades-old records, I found something that made my breath catch. The HOA didn't own the water rights to this neighborhood. They leased them, and their lease was set to expire. Not in years, not in months, but in exactly 3 days. That's when the idea hit me. If they thought they could play with our water supply, I would show them what real power looked like. I wasn't just going to switch it back. I was going to own it. And when the HOA came crawling for their precious water, I'd be the one holding the faucet. I spent the next 3 days making sure my plan was perfect. The first step was getting in touch with the county's water management office. I needed to confirm if the water lease was really expiring and if it was up for sale. While I walked into the office, a tired-looking clerk barely glanced at me as he pulled up the records. But when he saw the expiration date, his eyebrows lifted. He told me that yes, the lease was indeed about to expire, and yes, it could be purchased by anyone with the right paperwork and the right amount of money. I asked how much, expecting some ridiculous number, but when he gave me the figure, I nearly laughed. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't impossible either. The HOA must have assumed no one would be interested in buying it, that no one would even look into it. That was their biggest mistake. I wrote a check on the spot, sealing the deal before Richard or anyone at the HOA even realized what was happening. As of that moment, I wasn't just another homeowner in the neighborhood. I was the new owner of their water supply. I drove home with a grin on my face, already picturing the moment Richard found out. But this wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. My father had suffered because of them. My neighbors had suffered. They had poisoned people, all for their so-called community standards. It was time they learned what it felt like to be powerless. When I got home, I didn't waste a second. I called a private contractor and arranged for a team to shut off the main water valve supplying the HOA-controlled homes. Since I now own the lease, I had the legal right to do so. It was as simple as flipping a switch. But I wasn't stopping there. I made sure to send out letters to every single homeowner in the neighborhood, explaining what had happened, detailing how the HOA had poisoned their water, and letting them know that if they wanted access to clean water again, they would have to come through me. I made one thing clear. I wasn't doing this to be cruel. I wasn't going to make them suffer the way Richard had made my father suffer. I was giving them a choice. They could either stand by the HOA, the same people who had poisoned them, or they could work with me to take back control of our community. The first day, nothing happened. The second day, chaos broke out. The HOA board members were scrambling, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. People were calling their office, banging on their doors, demanding answers. Richard must have been sweating bullets, because by the end of the second day, I got a furious email from him demanding that I undo this illegal stunt immediately. He threatened legal action. He accused me of tampering with HOA resources. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I replied with a simple message. You don't own the water anymore. I do. If you want it back, we need to talk. The next morning, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, there stood Richard, flanked by two other HOA board members. They looked exhausted, probably from dealing with angry homeowners all night. Richard tried to keep his usual smug expression, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He told me I was playing a dangerous game, that people needed water, that I couldn't just cut off a community like this. I told him I agreed completely. That's why I wasn't the one who had poisoned people in the first place. He didn't like that response. He started talking fast, throwing around legal jargon, saying I had no right to control the water. I let him talk. Then, when he finally stopped, I pulled out the official lease papers, proving beyond a doubt that I owned everything. His face turned pale. For the first time ever, Richard was speechless. I didn't slam the door in his face, though I wanted to. Instead, I made him an offer. The HOA could get their water back, but on my terms. First, they had to publicly admit what they had done. No cover-ups, no lies, no shifting the blame. They had to own up to poisoning people. Second, they had to remove every single ridiculous fine and restriction they had put on the homeowners. No more charging people for leaving their porch lights on too long. No more writing citations over flower choices. They had turned this neighborhood into a dictatorship, and if they wanted water, that had to end. And last, Richard himself had to resign as HOA president. He needed to step down immediately, and the community would elect a new leader, one who actually cared about the people. I told him he had 24 hours to decide. If he refused, I would go to the media with everything. Every document, every shady action, every detail of what they had done. He stormed off without another word. That night, I waited. I could only imagine the kind of meeting the HOA was having, the panic they must have been feeling. Without water, their power was gone, and they knew it. The next morning, I got my answer. The HOA sent out a public statement admitting what they had done. Richard resigned effective immediately. Homeowners cheered as they read the news, finally realizing they had been under the control of a corrupt system for too long. As for me, I did exactly what I promised. I turned the water back on, but this time it was under the control of the people. No more HOA interference. No more power trips. Just a neighborhood finally free from the tyranny of a few arrogant people who thought they could control everything. And as I watched Richard drive out of the neighborhood for the last time, I couldn't help but smile. Justice had been served. The fallout from Richard's resignation spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had once been too scared to speak up were suddenly vocal, sharing their own stories of HOA abuse. Homeowners gathered in small groups on sidewalks, chatting excitedly about the changes coming their way. Some elderly residents, who had been bullied into paying absurd fines for minor things like wind chimes or garden decorations, finally felt free to enjoy their own homes without fear. The HOA had ruled over them for too long, but with Richard gone and their water supply no longer under his control, the people had realized they were stronger together. But even though the battle seemed won, I knew better than to let my guard down. Richard might have been forced out, but the HOA board was still filled with his loyal followers, people who had benefited from his reign of control. They weren't going to accept this defeat quietly. Sure enough, by the end of the week, I started hearing whispers about a lawsuit. Some of the board members were working behind the scenes, trying to challenge my ownership of the water rights. They wanted to overturn the lease agreement, arguing that it had been a fraudulent purchase. I wasn't surprised. These were the same people who had ignored legal rights when they switched my father's water supply without warning. They believed they could bend the law in their favor, just like they had always done. But they had underestimated me. I had done my homework. The purchase was airtight, backed by county records and legally binding. Still, I wasn't about to sit back and let them make trouble. I needed to put an end to this once and for all. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Linda, who had taken on corrupt HOAs before and won. She wasted no time in filing a counter lawsuit, making it clear that if they pursued this case, I would go after them for damages. And I had plenty of evidence to support my claims. The poison water, the medical bills from my father's illness, the testimonies from neighbors who had suffered the same fate, all of it was on record. If the HOA wanted to fight, I was going to make sure they lost everything. Within days, their plans started falling apart. The county's legal office refused to support their claims, stating that my purchase was completely legal. Some of the remaining board members, realizing they were on the losing side, started resigning one by one. They knew that if this went to court, they would be the ones exposed for negligence and corruption. Then, just when it seemed like the HOA was finally crumbling, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at my doorstep, hand-delivered by one of my neighbors. It was from Richard. I hadn't seen him since he resigned, but now he was trying one last move. In the letter, he accused me of destroying the community and warned that if I didn't reinstate the HOA's control over the water supply, things would get worse. It was a threat, plain and simple. He wasn't done fighting, even if he had lost his official title. I could almost picture him sitting in some rented office, fuming over his downfall, desperate to claw back the power he had lost. I wasn't intimidated, but I knew that Richard wasn't someone who would go away quietly. He had spent years manipulating this neighborhood, controlling people with fear. If he couldn't use the law against me, he would find another way. That's when the sabotage began. It started small. One morning, I woke up to find my mailbox smashed to pieces. A few nights later, my car tires were slashed. Then, some of my father's garden plants, the ones he had spent years growing, were uprooted and scattered across the yard. At first, I thought it was random vandalism, but I knew better. This was personal. This was Richard. He had lost his title, lost his control, and now he was lashing out in the only way he could. He wanted to scare me, to make me regret what I had done. But all he did was make me angrier. I installed security cameras around my property, making sure every inch of my home was covered. I warned my neighbors to do the same. If Richard was targeting me, he wouldn't stop there. Sure enough, within days, other homeowners started reporting strange incidents. Someone had thrown trash all over Mrs. Thompson's lawn. Mr. Reynolds found a deep scratch running along the side of his car. A few families who had openly supported me in the HOA battle woke up to find threatening notes taped to their doors. Richard wasn't just coming after me. He was trying to scare everyone back into submission. He wanted the neighborhood to believe that without him, things would fall apart. But this time, people weren't scared. They were angry. One night, my security cameras finally caught him in the act. The footage showed Richard creeping onto my property just after midnight, carrying a bucket of what looked like paint. He was halfway to my front door when he spotted the cameras and froze. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring directly into the lens, his face twisted in frustration. Then he turned and ran. The next morning, I sent the footage straight to the police. Within hours, an officer showed up at Richard's house. He was arrested for trespassing and vandalism, And just like that, his reign of terror was over for good. The moment the news spread, the entire neighborhood erupted in celebration. Homeowners cheered in the streets, shaking hands, hugging each other. For the first time in years, they were free. No more ridiculous fines. No more intimidation. No more HOA corruption. With Richard gone and the board dismantled, the community came together in a way I had never seen before. We formed a new neighborhood association, one that actually listened to the people. We made sure that no single person could ever have the kind of unchecked power that Richard had abused. And as for the water supply, I made good on my promise. Every homeowner had access to clean, safe water without any interference from a power-hungry HOA. It was no longer about control. It was about taking care of each other, about making sure no one was ever forced to live in fear again. As I stood on my porch, watching my father sip a glass of fresh, clean water, I knew we had done the right thing. The neighborhood was finally ours again. With Richard arrested and the HOA completely dismantled, life in the neighborhood finally began to feel normal again. Homeowners who had once walked on eggshells, afraid of receiving a fine or warning letter, now enjoyed the simple pleasures of their own homes without interference. People started repainting their mailboxes the colors they actually liked instead of the dull beige the HOA demanded. Gardens flourished with bright flowers and decorations that had once been banned. Front porch swings reappeared. Kids played freely in yards without fear of noise complaints. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. Without the HOA breathing down everyone's neck, the community actually became closer. People were no longer just neighbors living next to each other. They were friends, allies who had stood together against corruption and won. The transformation was something incredible to witness, and I knew my father, who had suffered the most under the HOA's rule, deserved to enjoy every second of it. But I wasn't naive. I knew that just because Richard was gone didn't mean the fight was over completely. There were still traces of his influence lingering in the background. Some former board members who had resigned quietly were still trying to stir up trouble, though they no longer had the authority to enforce anything. I overheard conversations about a few of them trying to form a new HOA under a different name, hoping to regain control in a subtler way. Their plan was simple: convince people that without an official homeowners association, property values would drop, crime would rise, and the neighborhood would fall apart. They were preying on the fears of older residents, try to manipulate them into signing a petition to bring a new version of the HOA back. When I learned about this, I knew I had to act fast. These people had lost their power, and now they were desperate to regain it, even if it meant tricking their own neighbors into supporting them. I started going door to door, talking to people, making sure they knew the truth. I reminded them what life under the HOA had really been like: the unfair fines, the intimidation, the poison water. I showed them documents proving how the previous board had abused their authority, highlighting the money they had wasted on unnecessary legal battles instead of helping the community. And most importantly, I made it clear that we didn't need an HOA to keep our neighborhood safe and beautiful. We could take care of things ourselves. I wasn't the only one spreading the message. Many others who had suffered under the HOA joined me, making sure no one fell for the lies being spread by the old board members. Slowly but surely, we dismantled their efforts before they even had a chance to gain traction. People refused to sign the petition, and within a week, their little scheme collapsed. But just when I thought things were finally settled, something unexpected happened. I received a legal notice in the mail, informing me that a group of former HOA members were suing me for damaging the reputation of the community. They were actually trying to claim that by removing the HOA, I had caused financial harm to homeowners. It was laughable, but I also knew that legal battles, even ridiculous ones, could drag on and cause unnecessary stress. I immediately contacted Linda, my lawyer, and she assured me that this was nothing more than a desperate attempt by people who couldn't accept defeat. Still, we had to take it seriously. I spent days gathering even more evidence, statements from homeowners, financial records showing how the HOA had misused funds, even expert opinions from real estate analysts proving that property values had actually gone up since the HOA was removed. When the case finally went to court, it was an absolute disaster for the former board members. Not only did they lose, but the judge even scolded them for wasting the court's time with such a baseless claim. He ruled in my favor and even ordered them to pay for my legal fees. Their last attempt at revenge had backfired completely, and now they were the ones facing financial consequences. The humiliation was too much for them to handle. One by one, they either moved out of the neighborhood or quietly faded into the background, no longer daring to show their faces in public. It was finally over. The HOA, Richard, and all their supporters were nothing but a bad memory. With that final battle won, the community moved forward in ways no one could have imagined. We held our first ever community meeting, one that wasn't run by people looking to control and exploit us. Instead of ridiculous rules and fines, we talked about real issues, how we could improve local security, how to help elderly neighbors with home repairs, and how to maintain the neighborhood without unnecessary restrictions. We started a volunteer group that helped mow lawns and clean up public spaces, making sure everything stayed beautiful without forcing anyone to comply with absurd guidelines. Instead of an HOA enforcing rules with threats, we relied on cooperation and mutual respect, and it worked better than anyone expected. With time, even the media picked up on what had happened in our neighborhood. A local news station ran a story about our victory, detailing how we had overthrown a corrupt HOA and built something better in its place. People from other towns reached out, asking how we did it, telling us about their own struggles with abusive homeowners associations. It became clear that this wasn't just our battle. There are people all over the country dealing with the same kind of corruption, the same kind of control, and they were looking for ways to fight back. Our story became an inspiration. Some homeowners even started discussing ways to change laws that gave HOAs too much power, and I was more than happy to help in any way I could. Through it all, the biggest reward wasn't the media attention or the legal victory. It was the simple moments. Watching my father sit on his porch without stress, seeing kids ride their bikes without fear of complaints, knowing that no one had to worry about unfair fines or poison water ever again. We had taken back our homes, our freedom, and our dignity. And as I stood in my yard one evening, watching the sunset over a neighborhood that was finally at peace, I knew one thing for certain. We had won a fight that mattered, and no one was ever going to take that away from us again. The weeks that followed felt like a new beginning for the neighborhood. Without the HOA's control, people finally had the freedom to enjoy their homes without fear. Neighbors came together in ways no one had ever expected. Small community gatherings turned into regular events, barbecues, game nights, and even an outdoor movie night on an open lawn where the HOA had once banned unapproved social gatherings. There was laughter where there had once been complaints. People talked to each other instead of avoiding eye contact, worried they'd be reported for some ridiculous violation. It was a neighborhood again, not a prison controlled by a handful of power-hungry board members. My father, the one who had suffered the most under Richard's rule, finally seemed at peace. Every morning, he sat on his front porch, drinking his coffee, watching the world go by without a single worry about what absurd new rule the HOA might enforce next. He even started planting new vegetables in his garden, something the HOA had once fined him for because they claimed visible crops made the neighborhood look less desirable. Now his garden was thriving, and so was he. But as much as things had improved, I knew that power-hungry people never truly gave up. Even after their public humiliation, there were still whispers of Richard trying to make a comeback. Though he had lost everything, his title, his reputation, and even his ability to walk through the neighborhood without being laughed at, there were always those who couldn't let go of control. I kept my ears open, listening to any signs that he might be trying to rebuild his influence. But nothing ever came of it. He had burned too many bridges, made too many enemies. No one trusted him anymore, and without people to manipulate, he was powerless. Eventually, I heard that he had sold his house and moved to another town. The man who had once ruled this place like a king had been exiled from his own kingdom. With Richard gone for good, I turned my focus to securing the future of the neighborhood. I knew that it wasn't enough to just get rid of the HOA. We needed to make sure it never came back in any form. I worked with legal experts to draft a new community charter, one that made it nearly impossible for any HOA to form again. We created a simple set of guidelines, controlled directly by the homeowners themselves, with only one core rule. No one could ever have unchecked authority over anyone else's home. No ridiculous fines, no absurd restrictions, no corruption. Just a fair and democratic system where people work together instead of being controlled. When we put it to a vote, nearly every single homeowner supported it. It passed with overwhelming approval, ensuring that no HOA could ever rise again in our neighborhood. As months passed, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. The tension that had once hung over the neighborhood was gone, replaced by something better, a real sense of community. We had proved something important. People didn't need an HOA to live in a good neighborhood. They just needed respect, cooperation, and a shared goal of keeping their community strong. The fear that had once controlled us had vanished, replaced by trust. The nightmare of Richard and his HOA was now just a story, a warning of what happens when power is left unchecked. And I knew that if anyone ever tried to bring that kind of control back, they wouldn't stand chance. We had fought for our freedom once, and we would never let anyone take it from us again. And so, as I stood outside my father's house one evening, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that was finally ours again, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The battle had been hard, but it had been worth it. We had won. And this time, no one was coming to take it away.